Okay, we are live on Facebook, and this is ShonSpeaks with freeyourthinkingmind.com, the ShonSpeaks podcast, and I have a special guest with me. And I was first presented with Jennifer Fishburne's information with her channel by a lawyer friend of mine who sent me her video. And so I had to talk to her. I had to bring her on to the podcast and just have a discussion with her. And her name is Jennifer Fishburne. Now she lives in San Antonio still, right?
Yes.
And you did a video, I guess about 9 or 10 months ago.
Yeah, last July.
Okay. Entitled Why I Left Christianity. And so I want to kind of dive a little deeper into that. But before we go there, I do want you to just kind of give a quick introduction of yourself to my audience.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me on, Sean. My name again is Jennifer Fishburne. I live in San Antonio, Texas. And currently I am in insurance and retirement planning, life insurance and retirement planning. How much of an introduction do you want?
Are you married? How many children? Anything you want to know just personally?
Okay. All right. Well, I am divorced. I have 3 grown children and 1 grandson.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I want to just go right into it. Jennifer, you did this video, Why I Left Christianity. And as I was telling you offline, a lawyer friend of mine sent this video to me a couple of months ago. And I was sitting in my car and I decided to go ahead on and watch it instead of just adding it to the list of videos that I'm going to eventually get to. And when I started the video, I wasn't, you know how you start a video and be like, okay, I'll watch a little bit of it. But I didn't really have an intent to watch the entire video. But you started with a monologue. And I think that the monologue was so powerful that I actually typed it up and I'm going to read it.
Okay.
All right. The opening monologue says this: I am not mad at God. I am not hurt by the church. I do not think the Old Testament Jehovah is a mini monster. I am not confused about the end times. I am not bothered by a few discrepancies in the Bible. I can fully explain the creation story, Adam and Eve and the walking, talking serpent in the Garden of Eden. I have 0 problems with Noah's Ark, dinosaurs, talking jackasses, and Jonah being eaten by a fish. I do not blame God for children starving in India or Africa, or for not stopping COVID, or for my favorite candidate not winning the last election. I am not concerned about the logical fallacies regarding God's omnipotence, omniscience, or omnipresence. Modern day science is not my new religion. I do not think the Bible is a myth. I am not an atheist or an agnostic. I am not missing something in the Bible. I didn't just suddenly give up or quit after living the Christian life for 50 years and studying the Bible deeper than most. But I am no longer a Christian. End of quote. Jennifer, that was very powerful, because whether you are no longer a Christian and you're watching this, whether you are having some awareness that maybe there's something deeper about yourself that you need to connect with, the question that most times I get asked the most when people find out that I'm no longer a Christian, they assume, really, like it's not even a question. They make an assumption, then they ask a question. Who hurt you in the church?
Right.
What did you want from God that God didn't give you? And literally, I'm bombarded with that. And then after that assumption, then is, well, why? Well, why? It's like they cannot even grasp that maybe I just grew past something, right?
Right.
And I don't know if you ever heard of this man named Jeremiah Kumar. He's a documentarian, but he always quotes this. I think it's either an Asian proverb or it's an African proverb. But nevertheless, it says that, and I'm just paraphrasing, it's like having a raft and you're no longer in water. You're now on land, but you refuse to put the raft down.
Okay.
And you're carrying the raft on your back on land. And that to me is what religion and Christianity and church going and all that's what it became. I noticed it as a raft. I noticed that I wasn't in the water. I wasn't drowning, right? And I didn't need to say that it wasn't beneficial because, of course, I grew up all my life in church, right?
Right.
I wouldn't be who I am today, right? If I didn't have the upbringing the way my parents grew me up. But at the same time, that doesn't mean I have to continue to limit myself or force limitations on myself that don't apply or interpret life in a way now that now I see is really just limitations. And so I just love that opening. And I just want to go deeper with you. But I do want to talk about, tell me about that monologue.
Well, you pretty much nailed it on the head already. I already knew what I'm friends with several people who've gone through deconstruction already, and I watched what happened to them. And I did watch some of them become very angry and bitter at God. I watched some of them become, some people left just because they were hurt with the church. And I thought, well, that's not a very good reason. And I watched some people leave just because they didn't like the Old Testament God, and so I've watched many people go through deconstruction and deconversion. And so I kind of just said, well, none of those things apply to me. And I don't want to be that way. And if I am going to leave Christianity, it is going to be because I am a truth seeker, and the truth is not found in what I've been taught in the Bible and what I've been taught in church and what I've been taught with all the pastors and all that stuff. And so to me, being a truth seeker was number one. And so none of those reasons or excuses or whatever applied to me. And I thought, well, in my mind, they didn't go far enough, or it was not a good enough reason for them to leave Christianity. Yes, I do think it's good to leave Christianity, but I think that each person should have a really good reason to, and not just because you're mad at somebody. That's not a good reason.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you. I think, I'm with you on that. I do too think that you should leave Christianity, but it's not for me to make you leave it. And it's not for you to have some angry reason, right? I tell people all the time, my old pastor can call me for anything right now, and I would do it for him. Right. I'm still friends with many people in my church. I don't have any, there's no hurt there. No one made me mad. Right. It was really as if I noticed that I was just trying to contort myself into a story that didn't fit me. And I noticed it.
Yep.
I noticed that I was living my life trying to fit a story that didn't fit me.
Right.
And I started to ask myself, why do I think that I am this person, or these people are me? So when I was listening to your video, and I highly suggest that you go and watch her YouTube channel, that video, because you just really go deep and you break it down. And I love how you go backwards, showing your upbringing as a Christian and all of the things that, I call it implant into your subconscious about how you are supposed to be and who you are to be and what you are to do. And you talked about your mom taught you the magic prayer.
Right.
So I want you to kind of tell us, because I connect with that, because I thought it too. I never called it the magic prayer, but that's exactly a great description of how we are taught, how we're taught. So tell me about the magic prayer.
So, and I know different denominations do it differently, but basically the way that I was taught was that I had to admit that I was a sinner. And then I had to ask Jesus to forgive me for my sins and then ask him into my heart. And then he would save me and I would go to heaven when I died. And so to me, that was the magic prayer, because I remember my mom saying that it doesn't matter what happens after you pray the prayer, you're still going to heaven. So it was a once saved, always saved. Basically, that was my interpretation of once saved, always saved. And so there were other people, which I don't want to name, but other people that did not live a Christian life. And she would say, well, it's okay because she prayed the prayer. And I remember thinking at a very, very young age, well, that doesn't make much sense to me. Right. So that's why I call it the magic prayer. Because if you just say those words, it magically gets you into heaven, and doesn't matter how you live your life.
So let's talk about that, right? What are the assumptions that your mom implanted in you by having to do this magic prayer, right? Because you're saying that you're a sinner, that you need Jesus to come into your life, right? But there's underlying assumptions that I think as a child, of course, you were not even supposed to know that, right? You were supposed to take what your parents or the adults say is true. But I think a lot of times parents give us something that they haven't thought about themselves, right?
Right.
But there's an assumption there. There's this underlying assumption that you are a sinner.
Right.
An underlying assumption that Jesus came for you, right? Even if you want to believe in Jesus or not believe in Jesus, there's an underlying assumption there. And you never think to ask, does this apply to me?
Yep.
Right. And you break that down so perfectly just on that video, right? I've watched several of your videos, and it's like you really break that down if you're willing to listen, right? You are literally you have to assume. And remember, if you are assuming, then what is your view? Do you even get to have a view if you have to operate off the assumption first? Right?
Right. Well, if you grow up in it, you don't get to have a view, basically. It's really a form of brainwashing. So with children who grow up in church and a Christian home and Christian school, all that kind of influence, they don't know any different. They don't know that they should be asking other kinds of questions. And it's so drilled into you. It really is a form of brainwashing. And I know that parents have a very good intention in teaching those things to their children. I don't fault my parents for teaching me those things, because that's what they really believed. But that it's just it really is a form of brainwashing. And I find that most adults, I like to debate theology on Facebook a lot. And I find that most adults are not willing to actually come out of the teaching, especially if they've been in the same church all their life. So they're very, very, very indoctrinated in just one narrow set of theology and doctrines, right? And so they're not willing to even look at, is there anything else outside of that? And when I ask people questions like outside of the Bible, that's just like, can't even go there. No way can they even fathom asking those kind of questions, and so then it comes with different kinds of attacks at that point.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. But I think it's because of the psychological, I call it psychological abuse, right?
It is.
And I'm with you. I'm not mad that I was raised Christian. I'm not mad that I had a religious upbringing. I'm not mad at all, right? And I'm glad that I found my way to go past it, right? To learn from it what I can, what I could, what was good, what served me, right? But then grow past what I realized was limiting me, that was keeping me in that circle, right? But you, in that episode, you talked about a movie, A Thief in the Night, and you actually sung a verse of it, right? And I'm not gonna put you on the spot. You sung that verse, but the words, I do want you to talk about the words of that verse, and how now looking back at that movie and looking at that verse and thinking that that was true for you, how it impacted you.
Right. Yeah. So that movie, I had nightmares for probably 20 years, every single night, probably 20 years after that. And so I definitely call that psychological child abuse, adult abuse as well. I mean, it's just psychological abuse, that kind of stuff. And that was, really the thought that Jesus was coming back any day now. And if you weren't ready, which kind of that implication was, if you haven't confessed every single sin that you've done. Now, that was a different message than what I got from my mom, right? So this message from this particular movie was you had to continually confess your sins all the time. You're confessing your sins. You've sinned, oh, you better confess it. At night, you better go through your whole day and make sure that you said, I'm sorry for all the sins that you did. And if you missed one, you might not go when Jesus came. You might be left behind, right? So it was very, very fear mongering type of a thing, and it literally put the fear of God into people, but for something that was imaginary, And so then they had the whole video was about what would happen to the people who were left behind, and it was supposed to make you be very, very, very afraid of all of the things that would happen if you were left behind. So much so that you would make sure that you were not left behind.
Wow.
And,
now, Jennifer, I like to break that down because on one hand, you were taught the magic prayer.
Right.
You say this phrase and all is well. You've got your ticket to heaven.
Right.
But then on another hand, it was this constant having to sort of repent of sins that you didn't even get to define as sins. You had to take somebody's word that this is a sin, this is a sin, this is a sin, this is a sin. How do you psychologically align with that conflict?
As a child, I didn't. So, as a child, I just didn't, I didn't think very deeply through all of these things. It was just, well, that's what I'm told. And, so that's what I do, so I didn't think about those things until much, much, much later. And
Gotcha.
that's when things started not adding up for me.
Gotcha. So it's almost like on one hand, they gave you power, but took the power away.
Yes.
Right. Right.
Yep.
And then that has impacts in every other area of your life.
Yes.
Right. Because you told a story about you had met a Jewish man and you got married. And I think this was the marriage where you were married for like 20 something years.
23 years. Yes.
23 years. And I guess in the first few years of y'all's marriage, you were having some marital issues.
Right.
Right. And you had an affair with someone else and you got pregnant.
Right.
Married to one man, pregnant by another man. Right. And your husband at that time found out that you were pregnant and put a gun to your head and demanded that you have an abortion.
Right.
Please tell us about
that. You mean picking up from that point?
Just picking up from that point, because when I heard you talk about that, that was one, it just pulled me because it further added to the psychological conflict that to me religion put us in. Psychologically, in the area, in other areas, and specifically in the area of our relationships. So how is it that you were going to have an abortion? Because I know he put the gun to your head, but you felt like you had no choice. That's what I want you to talk about, why you felt like you had no choice.
Well, I mean, the issues that we had, really the whole marriage was his anger, and it was pretty extreme. He would yell at me for about 4 to 6 hours every single day. And that's why I actually, started seeing other men. It was pretty extreme. And he got to a point where he said, I don't want to be your friend anymore. And, when you're in your 20s, your husband says you don't want to be your friend, well, then you look elsewhere. You just can't, most people can't handle that. And then with that extreme amount of anger. So, I still take responsibility for what I did. It still wasn't right, but there were reasons for it. Nobody does those kind of things without a reason. So we were not Christians at that time. I didn't even think about God. Once I left home at 18, I never even thought about God again. It was kind of strange because I was in a Christian school, a Christian home, and church every time the doors were open. And once I left home, I just kind of walked away from all of it. And I didn't even have a reason. It was just kind of, I didn't have a reason to go to church anymore. So I just didn't go. So, I walked away once and then came back again after I was pregnant. Then my husband at the time, he so he held the gun to my head. I knew that he had basically that he wouldn't hesitate to use it. That's how I felt. He had tried to kill me earlier, and so I didn't have any reason to think that he wouldn't use it. So on the way to the appointment, then he said he wanted to stop by the chaplain's office at the military, the Army base, and talk to him first. And he had never spoken to a chaplain, and a chaplain can be any denomination. So it's kind of like a pastor in the military. And it's just kind of random as to who you get. So it's not like going to church. It's a little bit different from that. So you never know what kind of, I don't even remember what the denomination was of this guy. And so I had to wait out in the waiting room, and he was in there for an hour or so. And he came out and said that he had become a Christian. And because he'd become a Christian in the office, then we weren't going to have the abortion, and he wanted to adopt the baby as his own and raise the baby as his own. So I am very glad that someone spoke to him and helped him, through that time frame, and that I did not have to go through with the abortion, which for me, just kind of a little segue here. My values are still the same values. I still think the same thing about abortion as I did when I was a Christian. I guess my values are built on a stronger foundation than just the Bible. If your values are built only on the Bible, and then you take the Bible away, well then, and I've watched this happen over and over and over again, then your values just, where do you get them from? I have no idea where people get them from at that point. I'd like to find out. But my values have stayed the same because my values were built on more than just the Bible. So for me, I remember talking to a friend during that time period when I was about 18 or 19 years old, and I was definitely not going to church, had nothing to do with God. She was thinking about getting an abortion. And I said, why would you kill your child? And that was, I didn't say anything about God or the Bible or anything like that, but that was my thinking all along. So long before I heard anything about what the Bible says about it, that was my foundation on that. And so that was still my foundation at this point, right? I still wasn't living as a Christian at this point. So I am very grateful that I did not. We ended up giving the baby up for adoption, and I am very glad for that as well, because he continued to be angry, extremely angry for the rest of our marriage, and I think he would have taken it out on my son if we had kept him.
Okay.
I think that would have been really
I'm glad that you cleared that up, because at first I was thinking that you did give him up for adoption to somebody else, but then initially right here I thought that he adopted him and then y'all raised them together, but y'all gave. Okay.
No. Yeah, initially that's what he said, but then as I thought through it, I thought, well, that would not probably be a very good idea, because if he continues with his anger, then he's just going to be the brunt of it. And I did not want that.
Gotcha. So now that was a few years into your marriage, and you say you stayed married to him for 20 years, and you just made a comment that said that he was still very angry even after now becoming a Christian. But you stayed married to him. And it seems like, based upon your story, y'all, post him becoming a Christian and now you going back to Christianity, y'all really became very enthralled in and church and religion became, sort of, I mean, you went to so many different churches, big churches, and you played significant parts. I kind of want to talk about that, right? So, now y'all are back into Christianity, and now y'all going to different churches. I think the first church you mentioned was it may not have been the first church, but you said you went to Ted Haggard's church.
Right.
How was that experience? Because I remembered him.
Okay. He's so charismatic, and that's why, people liked him, basically. And I remember he did something different than anybody else. Now, this was in the early 1990s, probably, that we went there. And so at this time, this was completely unheard of. But he would take that microphone and he would go up and down the aisles, but he would go actually into the pews, sit down next to people and talk to them while he's giving his sermon. And he would actually ask the person he's sitting next to, which could be a complete stranger to him, and he would ask them a question about whatever point he was at in his sermon. And so he was interacting with the people in the audience as he was going along and literally sitting next to them. And of course, that attracted people by the thousands, So, he made everybody feel important. And it was very, very different from what you usually get, especially in a mega church. Now he started it just in his basement, if I remember correctly. And so it grew very, very quickly. And that's how it grew, is because he made everyone feel like they were important and that they actually had a voice. So, and I don't even know if there's any church that does that now. But that's really what made him stand out.
He made everyone feel important. It's amazing, because I think that that's kind of one of the manipulation tools, is that in a way, Christianity makes you feel important, right? Because it makes you feel like you have some advantage over other people, right?
That's right. That you're better than other people.
Exactly, right? When in actuality, you are important if you believe you're important. You are as important as you want to be, right? As much as I like you, Jennifer, I can't make you feel more important than you feel for yourself, right? But that's sometimes how we get caught up. It's like, okay, if I wear this label, I'm more important. I could become a VIP. I could become a very important person in the world.
Right.
When in actuality, when you peel back the layer, you're still who you are. And no matter how much your very important person label you try to hold, because what ended up happening is that you end up, because you now think that you're more important than the other person, in order for you to uphold that more importantness, you now usually judge other people.
Right.
And generally, as you're judging other people, it's really something that's underneath what you're dealing with that you've covered with your very importantness, right? And that's kind of what happened with Ted Haggard.
It is.
Right?
It is.
Right?
Yep. Yeah. And that was my first introduction to understanding that if you're talking about a certain subject over and over and over, it usually means that's the one you're dealing with.
Absolutely. So, yeah.
And that became very public for the whole world to learn.
Yeah, I think I still in the 90s, I think I was in college. I was in college, and I still kind of remember when all of that kind of got exposed about him. And but I can remember even then, I'm thinking to myself, like, and I probably was judgmental, right? Because that was my mindset, not understanding that he probably wasn't even, that was all he knew to do. Right? Because it's that conflict that seems to be normal, right? On one hand, you got the magic prayer, but then on the other hand, every little thing you do can be a sin, right? That's and you're trying to synthesize both, and it's hard, and it has a psychological impact. And most times it causes you to not show up authentically.
Yep.
Right. And so, but yeah, so now you go from Haggard's church. And then you started to become a part, I think you said, was a member of Concerned Women of America.
Right.
Right. So tell us, because I never heard. I know about Tim and Beverly LaHaye because I think Tim LaHaye was the one that wrote the Left Behind series.
That's right.
And I read literally every last one of them.
Yeah, I did too.
I got it back there on my bookshelf. Every last one of them I read. Right.
Yeah.
But again, that was me as an adult adding the layers to my psychological conflict, and I didn't even know I was doing it. Right. I was being afraid to live because I wanted to make sure I wasn't left behind.
Right.
Right. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't left behind. And so now, Concerned Women for America, what was that about?
It's a political action group for women, basically. Okay. So it was basically fundamental evangelical Christian women who wanted to be involved in politics. And so they came together as a large group and kind of a lobbyist type of an organization in Washington, D.C. I don't know if they're still doing that or not. I haven't looked in a long time. But I've always enjoyed politics. And so, I would go to some of the bigger meetings and stuff. And it was just a way to basically have them teach us what we should believe about politics.
Have them teach us what we should believe. And I think that's what trips me out with religion now, because it's like, okay, you're wanting to teach me how I'm supposed to think, which leaves no room for me to do my own thinking.
Right. So they would list what their policy views were. And I think Focus on the Family does the same thing, but they list their political policy views, and then they would say this candidate lines up with it, this candidate does not line up, and so therefore you need to vote for this candidate because they line up with our views. Yeah. It was kind of that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. Now, up to this point, you're back in the church. You're super involved. It seems like, right?
Yes.
But you said something that I thought was very powerful. You said that after you started attending the Assembly of God Church, and these are your words, you learn how to love people.
Yes.
Now that I had to stop and rewind that, because at that point you're an adult, right? And you've been in church. You grew up in church. You left it for a while, you came back, but you're now at the Assembly of God Church, and you finally feel like you now learn how to love people. I need you to explain that. How is it that you felt like, just talk to me about that.
Okay, all right. So I guess because I grew up in, and then shortly after I became a Christian again, I grew up in mostly conservative type churches. When I went to, because of that, it was I don't ever remember learning things on how to love one another. I don't remember any of the one anothering type of things. And I don't even remember a whole lot on love or anything like that. It was more a list of to-dos. So, make sure you pray every day, make sure you read your Bible every day, make sure you ask for forgiveness for your sins every day. Make sure you get baptized, because you're not going to go to heaven if you don't pray the magic prayer and get baptized, So it was just a list of things to do, which is probably why I just totally walked away from the church when I was 18 and moved out. So I had never really learned that, and I didn't have much of that experience growing up. My mom was extremely reserved. I really don't remember having conversations with my mom when I was growing up, and she did not believe, and this was kind of a thing that they were taught in parenting. Who was it? Dr. I can't remember the name now. There was one parenting book at that time. And basically he taught them, don't spoil your kids by touching them or holding them. And so I had very, very little physical touch. She would kind of give me a peck on the forehead when she tucked me in at nighttime, but never held me, never hugged me, never, no, I love you. She was never proud of me, anything like that. So I didn't have any of that growing up. I certainly didn't have any of that in the churches that I was at. So when I went to this Assembly of God church, and the only reason I did is because there wasn't any other choice. So I was stationed in Heidelberg, Germany, in the military, and you don't have a whole lot of choice where to go to church. So you can go to the chapel, but that's very generic, and it's just almost perfunctory type, rituals. And I had no interest in that. And then they had two churches for a choice. One was a conservative Baptist church, and the other one was Assembly of God. And we did visit the conservative Baptist church, and I immediately saw that it was so rules based. And I thought, I don't really like this. And so even though that had been my upbringing my whole life, I just thought, you know what, I don't feel comfortable here. So we went to the other church, and I didn't feel comfortable there either, but I wanted to try something new. And they had this song that they would play halfway through the praise and worship.
Mhm.
And what was it's been so long, I don't know that I can remember the song. Anyway, basically it was about show everyone that you love everyone. And what we were supposed to do is go around and give everyone a hug and tell them that we love them. Well, I was not in the habit of hugging anyone at that point. And so when I first started there, I had a newborn baby. And so that was when I would nurse my baby so that nobody could get near me. I'd go in another room, nurse my baby, and just kind of miss that whole part of the service. Well, then people started coming up to me and actually giving me a hug from behind anyway. And I could not do anything about that. And at first, it really, really bothered me. And then we had so many functions together as a church. So there were times when we would have potlucks every Sunday and then just stay for hours and hours and just, play outside. We had parties as often as you could think of a reason to have a party. I lived near several people in the church. And so we started just taking walks together on a regular basis. And sometimes we would just meet with other families during the week just for a random dinner. And we had small group Bible studies together in people's homes. And because we all lived very, very close together in the military, it quickly became our family. And so during holidays, for example, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, all that kind of stuff, most people did not go home to see their families. It was too far and cost too much money. And so we all just celebrated the big holidays together. And when you start doing that, well, they become your family. And so these people became way more family to me than I'd ever experienced before. And so as they began to hug me every week. Eventually I just started to kind of melt and just kind of, learn that, okay, this is actually probably a good thing. This is long before I understood the value of physical touch, but I said, you know what, I'm just going to do my own experiment. And so I was on the board of directors for the Protestant Women of the Chapel, which was a ladies' Bible study. We had 60 ladies, and there were about 60 different denominations that were represented here. So everything. And what was interesting was that we never ever had an argument, even though we were doing Bible study together.
Yeah.
But it was a very cold place. And so I thought, well, I'm going to see if this really makes a difference. So I went in one day and I said, I'm going to start hugging every lady when she comes in the door. Now, these ladies grew up like I did. They weren't used to it. They were not used to it at all. And so some of them were very uncomfortable with that when I first started doing that. And I was equally uncomfortable. And so after a while, I noticed that they started hugging one another. And I didn't have to ever say anything. I just did it by example. But I started noticing that I changed inside. And that's when I really started learning how to love people and started doing actually Bible studies on how to love other people. So there were a lot of things that happened during those 6 years that we were there. But I look back and I did not know how to love people at all before I started going to that church.
Wow. So that's amazing. You grew up Christian in America and you went to church a lot, but yet you were not taught or even by example of how to love people.
Right.
Right. And that rings so definite in my ear because as a person that identified as Black in a country where there's a dominance in the conservative, white people who identify as white, dominance, they're conservative, they're religious. And that's the feel that I get from that, is that although you're giving me the rules, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, there's no love there. There's no connection there, right? And I think it's because it in order for you to feel like you keep a certain level of power, you can't actually feel like you and I are the same, are connected, are one. You have to sort of have that division there, right, in order to perpetuate division, right? Because once you kind of come into an understanding that we really are all connected, right? I was telling you offline, there was something in the video where you were talking about you decided to wear pants, wear pants, and you were kind of afraid that God was going to do a thunderbolt or something if you put pants on, because and we're going to talk in a minute about legalism. And you kind of did this in the video, like he was just kind of waiting, like, okay, I'll put these pants on, is lightning going to strike? And I totally connected to that, because when I decided to stop going to church every Sunday, initially for me, I thought if I did not have a legitimate reason not to go to church, something bad was going to happen on Monday. I was going to have a bad week. Something was not going to work out. And so when I one day didn't go to church on Sunday, and I did not have an excuse, and I did not try to have an excuse, it was just I wasn't going. I literally was like, and the lightning didn't strike. And I connected to your story, right? And I don't even know you, but we literally had a very similar growth experience, right? And so I just thought that was interesting. But when you said that you were in Germany at this Church Assembly of God before you learned how to love people, I just thought that was amazing. All right, so now let's go here. You did the magic prayer when you were young. You got baptized. You got baptized a second time.
Right.
Then you got baptized a third time.
Right.
Did the magic prayer, did you not believe that the magic prayer worked?
Well, in Baptist circles, the magic prayer has to be accompanied by the baptism. And then, like, if you backslide, you have to have another baptism. So the baptism kind of covers for the backsliding, all those sins between.
And this is the funny part. You're gonna always, by definition, you're gonna always backslide, right? Because you're gonna always think something you're not supposed to think, and that's a sin, right? So it kind of keeps you on this loop, right? Which is good, because it funds churches, it builds buildings, right? So it does all of that. All right, I do want to talk about this, because this is something that I think either I didn't know anything about, or I may have forgotten about. The quiverful, is it quiverful movement?
Quiverful.
You are a part of that.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
So quiverful just means to have as many kids as you can, and to never use birth control. And the goal, pretty much in the church where I was to have a dozen kids. And if you didn't have a dozen, then you were really looked down upon. You did not meet the standards, basically.
Okay. And who was the leader of that church that you went to? Doug Phillips. Now, is this the church that you said that you got excommunicated from?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And 10 years later, you said that you found out the reason, because you never knew why you got excommunicated.
That's right.
But 10 years later, you found out why you got why Doug Phillips excommunicated you from this church. And why was that?
Because he wanted to sleep with my daughter's best friend, and he knew that I would do something about that. And so he had to get me out of the way.
Wow. So once again, that's a psychological conflict that he was even having. Right?
Yes.
But that he never got, see, to me, this is what religion does. It causes you not to face your own reality. Right. When I started to move away from religion, all I found is that I was having to face my own reality, whatever it was. I just had to say, Sean, your stuff, whatever that is, right? Just face it. right? If I'm holding a red cup, Sean, you're holding a red cup. Stop trying to make the red cup blue. It's red, right? Like
Right.
just face what's the truth, right? If it's something that I want to change, Sean, you eat too many sweets. Stop eating so many sweets, right? Stop trying to psychologically fool myself into something, right? That psychological conflict that I think religion feeds. But the reason I think religion feeds it is because that's how it's funded. Religion isn't funded once you're not going to fund religion once you're willing to face your own reality.
Right.
Right? Because once you're willing to face your own reality, you're not seeking somebody else to tell you your values. You kind of know what you should or shouldn't do based upon the fact that I respect you, right? And because I respect you and I think I'm connected to you, that's the limit. That's the limitation. My respect of you is my limitation, not so much my, not my upbringing in the church and the rules and regulations of do this, don't do this, don't do this, right? It's just the fact that I love you, I respect you, and I think we're connected, right? We're connected, and the reason why we're existent is because we're all connected. And if I can just connect with that understanding, right, then there's going to be things that I'm not going to do simply because I know you, Jennifer, right? Simply because I feel for you because I know how I feel, and so that is very interesting. Now I do want to go to this towards this last segment. Okay, my phones keep ringing. You talk about your new awareness about the law of Moses.
Okay.
And you started to talk about how it sort of clicked because you had started finally studying the Bible yourself, as opposed to defaulting believing what someone said. And it clicked for you that the law of Moses didn't apply to you.
Well, kind of. It didn't really click.
Okay, so explain that.
Yeah. So at the time, the church that I was in, which was a non-denominational, but pretty much a Reformed Baptist church, and we were there for probably 6 years or so. Then that was, they taught only from the Old Testament. So never, ever, ever were we taught anything from the New Testament or anything about Jesus or grace or anything like that. So it was just a heavy, heavy emphasis on the law, the law, the law. And then at the same time, and at home and in the evening, we were focused on the Messianic Judaism movement. And so, of course, they only focus on the law as well. So I was steeped in the law of Moses and wanted to live my whole life according to the law of Moses. I thought that was going to give me the structure that I needed. Those were the rules that if I could keep those 613 rules, then I would be okay. And so then there was a pastor. He's actually a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary that I was online one day, and I was actually saying that that the Bible says that we should still do slavery because that's what it says in the Old Testament, right? And so he came on and he said he started to challenge me that we were not.
Wait. Go back because I want to make sure you said so. You at that time you thought that we should still have slavery because the Bible.
Yes.
Wow.
Because that's
listen.
In the Old Testament, that's what they had, right? They had a lot of slaves, and the laws were about how you treat your slaves, but it didn't say that slavery was wrong. And the Bible never says slavery was wrong.
The Bible doesn't. It does not. Yeah.
Right. So I living my whole life by the Bible, So he challenged me that we were actually not under the law of Moses. Well, that's the first time I'd ever heard that. And I was shocked. And so he started just peppering me with questions. And I remember the one that really stood out to me was, he says, do you go out in your backyard every time when it's your time of the month? And I thought, how dare you speak to me that way? And I knew that I didn't, but I thought, how dare you? And so it was the first time that I experienced real cognitive dissonance. And I was like, okay, well, wait a minute. Why am I not doing that? So just for a little context, how extreme I had become was I wanted my then husband and my son to wear robes like Moses. I didn't want them to shave the corners of their beards or to trim the corners of their beards. I want them to grow long, long beards. And I thought that we should be sacrificing animals in our backyard. And so I had become very, very extreme, right? It wasn't just the slavery thing, it was everything. So because that's what I saw the Bible saying. And so that's what I really tried to live my life by. And so when he started peppering me with questions, and he asked me if I was doing a whole bunch of these other laws. And I realized, okay, well, maybe I'm not doing as good as I thought I was. Then he offered to teach me a Bible study about the law of Moses. And he'd been teaching this Bible study for 35 years. I was actually his last student before he died. And so at the beginning, I had an idea that he might be right, but I wasn't willing to give up the law of Moses at all. And this is how I've always been as a truth seeker. I had to see it for myself. I had to be 100% convinced that he was right, that we were not under the law of Moses. And so for the next 90 days, I studied 8 to 12 hours a day on the law of Moses. I looked up, there's 450 verses in the Bible about the law of Moses. I looked up every single one, read them all in context. And I had a hard time finding myself in any one of those, all 450 passages. And I thought, well, that's not about me. That one's not about me. But I still was sure that it had to be about me, so I just kept studying and did his whole Bible study. During the course of that study, because he was a Dallas Theological Seminary professor, he also taught me logic, biblical grammar. He taught me how to read the biblical Hebrew and the biblical Greek and how to interpret them for myself. He taught me hermeneutics. And so he just taught me all of these Bible study tools that I had never, ever had before, because you don't get that as a regular person just going to church. And so anyway, at the end of those 90 days, it was like a light bulb just went off. After a lot of study, it was the light bulb. Oh, the law of Moses doesn't apply to me because it has no jurisdiction over me. I was never under their authority. It was only given to Israel, Old Covenant Israel, at Mount Sinai. Those people standing there. I wasn't there. I've not ever been a part of Old Covenant Israel. That's not me. And that law has nothing to do with me. So that was kind of that was my first step outside of regular Christianity.
Wow. That, that is absolutely an amazing story, because I think all my life, I thought that everything in the Bible was me, right? As far as, I thought that I was a Gentile, right?
Right.
And it never dawned on me, Jennifer, to ever look the word up.
Right.
Right? It just never dawned. It's just, I'm a Gentile. But then deep within me, right, I felt sort of slighted. Like, well, why would Jesus come for the Jews, and not for the Gentiles? Why am I second class? Why I'm second? I'm an afterthought, right? That was my thing. Why am I afterthought, right?
Right.
But I couldn't face the fact that I had that question, because I accepted the assumption that I was a Gentile. And you see how sometimes you can live your life by assumptions that limit your being, your becoming, and you've never thought to even notice that you're living by an assumption. And you dang sure ain't questioning the assumptions, because you don't even know you're living by the assumption, right? I did not recognize until I did that I was accepting an assumption that did not apply, or that was not true for me. And all I had to do was look up a word, right? And I love to make this little joke. I said, the Roman Catholics, the Protestant, the pushers of Calvinism, they never saw Google coming. Google messed it all up, right? Google messed it all up, right? Because now I don't necessarily got to go to the library and read all of these books that sometimes can be hard to read. I can Google. I can
Right.
go onto a YouTube channel. I can go on somebody's channel like yours that do very great breakdown of things, right? They never saw Google coming. And
Right.
what Google allowed is for my own thinking to come in, right? See, at first you don't get to have your own thinking or non-thinking. You just went to church, they say this, 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 you believed it. And you make this point that I thought was so powerful, right? Because and I'm so connected. When you're reading the Bible, because we're taught that the Bible is the inevitable, inherent word of God, right? And
Right.
we kind of believe that it's a he and he dropped it down and this is what you're supposed to live your life by. But you said you have to be careful of church words.
Right.
I was like, the girl said church words, but I totally connected with what you were saying. And so I want you to talk a little bit before we close out about church words, because I think you're on the money with this.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, the first church word is church. So the word church, actually, the way we use it in America is not in the Bible. And so it just means a group of people who are called out from a larger assembly. So if you have people in a whole city, and then you have like a city council, for example, the city council is a church. That's actually how the term is used. So it's just a small group of people within a larger group. That's all it means. So the word ecclesia there. And so the way that we use church today is made up. It's just made, the church has given it this definition. So it has nothing to do with it, So, and then there's simple words like holy, and that one just means actually set apart. So if I have, like, for instance, when I go on a trip, I have a set of plastic dishes that I take. They're set apart for a special purpose for going on a trip because they're not going to break if I put them in my truck and I go, right? And so that doesn't make them holy as in the church sense, but that's exactly what the word means. It just means set apart for a special purpose. So I found that there were just tons and tons and tons of words in the Bible that we've given a meaning to that was never intended in the original. Sin is a really good one. All it is an archery term, and it just means that when in archery, when you pull the bow and arrow back, you're trying to aim for the bullseye. If you miss the bullseye, you sin. And that's literally all it means, is to miss the bullseye. So, so then we've got, all of the words atonement and redemption and reconciliation, all of that kind of stuff that we have as, all of those are definitely church words and stuff too. So we've got the complicated church words, and we've got the basic everyday church words. And we still think that, you have to see them this way because the church always teaches that, but actually it's not. When I started looking them up, I used a tool that would help me to see how these words were used in their contemporary language. So how were they written in other books that were written at the same time period? What did they mean? And that's what helped me to come out of all of that. Because if you're just looking at Strong's Concordance, for instance, which a lot of Christians still use, all he does is he gives you the traditional church definition. He wrote the church definitions, and that's exactly what you're going to get from him. It doesn't mean that that's the right definition. So I wanted to know, what did the original word mean when they originally used it? And that's how I started coming out.
So what about hell?
Hell, so hell, it depends on where that is written. So hell is actually several words that are translated as hell. And so some English Bibles don't have the word hell in it at all because they've realized that it's a total mistranslation. So for example, one of them that's commonly translated as hell is actually the word Gehenna. And that's just a valley that's outside of the city gates of Jerusalem that was their garbage dump. And at that time, how did they get rid of their garbage? They burned it. So it was a burning garbage dump, and that's what we've translated as hell, but it's literally a burning garbage dump.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that always, just shocks me because we never the reality of it is that most of us, Christian or not, didn't ever think to look the word up,
No,
right?
no,
We just didn't. I mean, and that's just fact, right? We just didn't think. And some people, I'm sure, because I have a lot of people that are still very religious that watch my show, and I'm sure it's like you don't want to look it up because you don't want to be. Well, you may not even know that you need to look it up, even though we're saying look it up. But a lot of
right,
times we don't want to grow, right?
right.
We don't want to grow, right? Because I love how you said, do you need to be saved? Well, yes, but not in the way that you've been taught. It's really saving yourself from whatever the limitations of your becoming from yesterday. Just
Right,
just grow,
right,
learn, be
right.
willing to listen to something that may challenge what you think or
Mhm.
view. Listen to both sides or all three, four, five sides, right? Create your own side, right? You have to, give yourself back the authority to see it afresh,
Right, right.
right? Because to me, that's the one thing that, to me, religion does a very good job of. It takes away your authority to see anything anew. You
Right.
don't, it tells you how to think, how to feel, how to see. And it's like, okay, wait a minute, do I not get to just have the experience in this moment and my interpretation of the experience in this moment,
Mhm.
right? It pretends to have an answer that we know that it doesn't have.
Mhm.
And one of the things that you make a point of is you talk about um, Ecclesiastes 12:7, and you quote that, and it's basically, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Because a lot of times people do read the Bible, or they think that the Bible, because they haven't read it, is telling you what's going to happen to you after you die,
Right,
right? And we get caught up in the church words of heaven and hell, right?
right,
And then that just opens us up to manipulation because you become afraid of hell, which is made up, and you become so eager for heaven, which is made up,
right.
that you don't really live today, and then you get caught up in wanting to
First
be
part.
yeah, you get caught up in wanting to be a VIP, a very important person, right?
Yep.
So you don't face your own realities in life, right? And you think that if you hold these labels, it's going to make you more special, right? But at
Yep.
the end of the day, when you die, what we call death, and I die, we go into the ground.
That's right.
Your proclamation of whatever label you want to hold doesn't stop you from having that same experience after death. And I
Mhm.
just thought that that was that's a powerful point because I think sometimes sometimes you got to stop and chunk it, break it down into small bites, right? Because at the end of the day, whether I'm proclaiming to be a Christian, not a Christian, an atheist, an agnostic, or no label at all, right? When my physical body is no longer operational, I am going back to the ground whether you bury me or not,
Right.
right?
Yep.
So me getting caught up in the labels of thinking this is going to make me more important, this is going to make me this, you're buying into somebody else's story. You're
Mhm.
buying into great imagination,
Yeah.
right? Great
Yep.
imagination. And I think that that's kind of what has happened with for me with religion. I realized that, hey, these are great stories. I'm not, I don't get into debates with people about whether or not the Bible is real or fake, or it doesn't really matter to me. It's a good story. There's great stories in it. There's not so great stories in it. I
Right.
take I take what is usable. I take what's not usable, and I disregard it, right? Because at the end of the day, I have to give myself authority to interpret and to have my own perspective. And I
Mhm.
cannot let other people take that away from me
Mhm.
anymore, right?
Mhm.
In the name of God. Because what I begin to realize is that people will use God to kill me.
Right.
People will use God, and you could attest to this. people will use God to continue to have slavery, right?
Yep. Yep.
You know, and so it's like, okay, wait a minute. Let me distance myself for just a moment and let me just take in this beautiful life, right? And experience this life that we have all together. And I don't need for you to think that you're more important than me. And I don't need to think that I'm more important than you, because at the end of the day, when we die, we both going back to the dirt.
That's right.
Right. And I love how you say, and the Ecclesiastes 12:7 say, and the spirit shall return it to God who gave it. And you say, what does that mean? I don't know. And you don't know either. Right. Because at the end of the day, that was a philosopher philosophizing.
That's right.
That's it. Right. And because I'm a philosopher, I know that sometimes I say shit, it's like, I'm just saying it. I don't really know. It may sound good. You know what I'm saying? All right, so I got a few just follow-up questions you can answer real quick.
Okay.
Does being a Christian give you an advantage in this life?
I don't think so. I think at this point, I would say it's a disadvantage. And I think it's because, a lot of what you've talked about in the time we've had together today. So you think that you are better than other people. And so no matter how hard you try, you're going to look on other people and you're going to judge them. You're going to shame them. You're going to blame them. You're going to put guilt upon them. You're going to condemn them. And it's those kind of things that are a major, major part of Christianity. And that does not make either the Christian doing them better. It makes you actually a bad person, or the person on the receiving end better. So neither one is coming up, right? Both are being brought down by those kind of values in life. And I see that over and over and over and over again. And yeah, there's a grace movement now, but it's only like a tiny step out of that. They still have a whole lot of stuff that they hold on to, and they don't know it. They don't even realize it. So do I think that Christianity makes someone better? No, I don't. I think it's actually harmful and it holds people back. And another thing that you were talking about, where we've got the imaginary heaven and the imaginary hell, when Christians spend their whole life thinking that they're going to heaven when they die, most of them waste their whole life here on earth. Yeah. And so if it causes you to waste the one life you've been given, the gift of life that you've been given, then I think Christianity is a really, really bad thing.
Absolutely. I have to agree with that, right? I have no problem with you being a Christian, other than if it's causing you to waste your life. Because I think for me, that's what I think I found myself doing. It was literally like I was holding my breath, like afraid to die, but thinking that I could not have my best life until I die.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing. It's like, no, have your best life now. Live your best life now. Don't wait for heaven, and don't feel like you have to judge me, punish me, right? If we have a different view, okay, we're different. We can have a different view. Maybe we can meet in the middle, we can whatever, but your right doesn't make me wrong, and my wrong or my right doesn't make you wrong, right? And I think that it's just allowing yourself to be in your own life, right? Is what when Christianity removed itself from my life, I showed up, right? I showed up. I became present to my life, right? And because I became present to my life, Jennifer, I began to be able to take responsibility and change whatever I wanted to change, or at least work on changing it.
Right.
But it's hard to change something if you're unwilling to face it, or if you're living in a denial, right? Because you feel like, well, I'm not going to face this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to judge Jennifer about it. Right. Because I think that's what happens with religion. I'm not going to face it. I'm just going to judge Jennifer about it. And because I'm judging Jennifer, I'm somehow going to get kudos by the man above.
Right.
Right. Because I think that's what we do. Okay.
That's exactly what happens.
Who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Nobody knows.
Who wrote about Jesus when he was alive?
Nobody.
Why do we argue about the details of Jesus's words? If no one wrote about Jesus while he was alive, I don't even know what Jesus actually said.
It's kind of like looking at Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, because they all have a moral of the story, right? And then arguing about the details of who said what in the fairy tales. It is the equivalent of that in my mind. There's a good moral to the story, take it, right? But the rest of it, it literally is just a story. We have zero evidence for Jesus, none
Absolutely.
whatsoever.
Absolutely.
So, look at it as any other story that you might like, and learn something from it. I can learn something from every fiction story. I can learn something from, real stories too, but these are actually fiction stories. So just take them as such and don't get so caught up into, well, why isn't it real? Who cares? It's a fiction story, learn from it.
Absolutely. And we'll end with this, because it's a fiction story. Learn what you can learn, but don't be the story.
Right.
Because I think that a lot of times, especially in my community, we've tied ourselves to this story of thinking that we are the Hebrews, or we're in the 400 years of punishment by God, right? And yes, if you identify as an African American, if your forefathers you felt were enslaved, then I can see how you can see yourself in that story, right? But seeing yourself seeing experiences in a story doesn't make you the people of the story.
Right.
And the reason why you need to make that distinction, because I find that if you see yourself in the story and you make yourself the people of the story today, right? The problem is, what happens is you're not paying attention to today, because today you're not enslaved, right? Today you're not being punished and wondering or whatever it is. You're not. That's not the case. So you're missing out on being able to actually appreciate what's going on into your day, because you've tied your mind into being the story, or
Right.
people in a story. Because the reality of it is that if you do that, every time something happens that you don't like, or that you feel is unfair, you're gonna tie the reasons for those things happening to you being the character in that story.
That's right.
And let me tell you, when you do that, all you do is extend the drama of that story in your own life. That's all you do, right? Mm-hmm. So now it's like, okay, that's a story. I can learn from that story, but I am not that story. I am no character in that Bible. I have no idea who even wrote the Bible, right? There's plenty of books. I love books. I got plenty of books, right? But I'm not those books. I'm not the characters in those books, right? And I think that's and it's power in that, and to just being able to live your life, understanding that I can learn from a story, but that doesn't mean that I have to become the character of the story. Because if you become the character of the story, your emotions are going to be tied to the story.
Right.
Even though right now you're not even experiencing it. Wow. Yeah. All right. So explain prayer, and then we'll close out. What is prayer?
Explain prayer. So prayer according to the Bible, or prayer in reality?
You can do let's do a comparison. What's prayer in the Bible, and then what's prayer in actual reality? When you just really just take out the Bible interpretation and just think about it with the
So our minds are very, very powerful. Mm-hmm. So in our minds as Christians, we think that we're having a conversation with Jesus, or with God, or with the Holy Spirit, or with whoever it is that you're praying to. And because our minds are so powerful, we actually have this imaginary conversation with ourselves, and we think that God is speaking back to us, and it's really just our own thoughts that we're manifesting there. But prayer is really nothing more than energy. And it's energy that's connecting either with something else. If you're praying for someone, if I were to be praying for you, for example, I'm just basically sending my energy to you. And if we're on the same vibrational level, which is a whole other thing, but then you're going to be able to feel those prayers. And so it's really just, I'm sending you good energy. That's really all that is if I'm praying for you. Okay. So if I send you good energy, that might raise your vibrational level, and then you might actually feel something different. It's not something spiritual, and it's not something woo woo and all that kind of stuff. It's just actually how the universe works. So, but most of the time we pray as Christians, we prayed for things that we thought were God's will because they were our will, but they really had nothing to do with that whatsoever. And I always think of the first time that I prayed for an election, and a presidential election, and then the other person won, and I was devastated. I really thought, my prayers didn't work, but I believed with all my heart. I had more than the faith of a mustard seed, a grain of a mustard seed, right? I had lots of faith, and it still didn't work, and so it made me think, okay, so does prayer actually work when we do those kind of things? And I think COVID is an excellent example of that. How many Christians have prayed that God would end COVID? Well, was God not powerful enough to keep it from happening in the first place? That's what I want to know. But now we've got millions of Christians all around the world, not just in America, right? All around the world who are praying for COVID to end. And what has happened? Nothing, not a thing. So, there's a lot of, we need to understand that prayer is mostly in our imagination, but it also does connect us to other people when we are praying for other people and just sending them our energy. So that's a kind of a short version.
No, absolutely. And I love that. I absolutely love that. I love I think that, that it's that energy connection. It's knowing that we're in that sort of that field together, and we magnetize to each other.
It
right?
is. It is
And
very much.
we magnetize, in creating things, right? And I like what you said. You made a point in your video where you said, okay, I know some of you might not even like me, but you can't help but listen to me, right? And it's because because I think that, but if you just stop, that's true, right? Because it's literally almost like you're drawn, and you're like, okay, why am I drawn to that, right?
Yep.
And I just think when you start to appreciate the power of your own existence, right? You don't need to give it to a man in the sky, right? You don't
Right.
just you don't have a need. I don't need, if me and you have a synchronicity, I don't need to credit God with it.
Right.
I just don't need to do that anymore. I can just say, wow, I know we're in the electromagnetic field. I know that we magnetize to each other, and we magnetize, right?
Yep.
Now let's see what we can do together. That, to me, that's a better explanation, because that's putting it back on me, as opposed to putting it, out on some God that may or may not show up the next time.
Right.
Because what happens is, when you start to credit everything to God, and then God doesn't show up the way you want God to show up, you can't help but to create some frustration with yourself right there.
Right.
You just can't help but to do it. And there's no need to do that.
Then you start to blame the devil. That's when, so if it's not God, well, then it must be the devil. And so it's never taking responsibility for your own self. But that's what I found. And I still see many Christians do this, is either they give God all the credit, or it was God's will that the bad thing happened, or they give Satan all the credit, and then some days when a good thing happens, then they defeated Satan that particular day. But most of the time, Satan's in control. They has far more power and authority than God does. They just don't realize they're doing that.
Exactly. And I will just end with this. Who is the person that made the decision that it was God or the devil? It's always you.
That's right.
You. So maybe you are God and the devil. Interesting conversations. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for coming onto the podcast. I so appreciate you just taking the time out of your day and having this amazing conversation with me.
Well, thank you for having me on, Sean. I really appreciate it. Love meeting you. Love meeting you as well.
Ashe, free thinkers, Ashe, may what you say manifest in your life today and every day. Ashe.